The morning sun rose blood-red over Tinian Island on March 17, 1945, painting the tarmac in shades of copper and gold. Captain Robert Bob Fitzgerald stood beneath the massive aluminum fuselage of his B-29 Superfortress, running his hand along the cold metal skin like a man checking a horse before a long ride. The aircraft towered above him, nearly 3 stories tall at the tail, its 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines gleaming like silver promises in the dawn light. "She's loaded heavy today, sir," Staff Sergeant Mike Chen said, clipboard in hand, his breath visible in the cool morning air. 31,000 pounds of incendiaries. Full fuel tanks. "We're pushing maximum gross weight." Fitzgerald nodded slowly, his jaw tight. He'd flown 22 missions over Japan in the past 4 months, and every single one had been a conversation with death. The B-29 was the most advanced bomber in the world, capable of flying higher and farther than anything the enemy possessed, but it was also temperamental, complex, and unforgiving. The engines, in particular, had earned a deadly reputation. They ran hot. Dangerously hot. And when pushed to their limits at maximum weight and altitude, they had a tendency to catch fire, seize up, or simply explode. "Temperature's already 78 degrees down here," Fitzgerald said, squinting up at the cloudless Pacific sky. "It's gonna be a furnace up there." The mission briefing had been short and brutal. They were part of a 300-plane strike force tasked with hitting the port facilities at Kobe, Japan's 6th-largest city and a critical industrial hub. The flight would take them nearly 1,500 miles over open ocean, most of it with nothing below but endless blue water. No islands. No landing strips. No rescue ships for hundreds of miles in certain stretches. If something went wrong out there, you had 2 choices: keep flying or go into the drink. Fitzgerald's crew assembled on the hardstand as the sun climbed higher. Lieutenant Danny Reeves, the co-pilot, was 22 years old and looked even younger, his face still carrying the softness of a kid who'd grown up in Iowa cornfields. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Tom Briggs was the oldest at 31, a former mechanic from Detroit who knew the B-29's 4,000 horsepower engines better than he knew his own wife. Navigator Lieutenant Jeff Kowalski carried his charts like sacred texts, constantly recalculating, always checking. Bombardier Lieutenant Sam Porter was quiet and precise, the kind of man who could drop ordnance from 28,000 feet and put it through a factory window. Radio Operator Staff Sergeant Eddie Nakamura, a Japanese-American from California, wore his headset like a crown. The 6 gunners, Matthews, O'Brien, Sullivan, Rodriguez, Jackson, and Taylor, moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd already survived too many close calls. The bomber's name was painted on her nose in white letters, Midnight Runner. Below it, a cartoonish image of a clock striking 12 with wings. At 0645 hours, the engines coughed to life one by one, each 18-cylinder radial roaring with a sound like controlled thunder. Black smoke belched from the exhaust stacks as the massive propellers bit into the humid air. Fitzgerald felt the vibration through the control yoke, that familiar thrumming that meant power, speed, and the promise of getting home alive. The tower gave clearance. Fitzgerald released the brakes. Midnight Runner rolled forward, picking up speed on the coral runway, the weight of 6 tons of bombs pulling her down like an anchor. 60 miles per hour. 80. 100. The engines screamed. The airframe shuddered. At 125 miles per hour, Fitzgerald pulled back on the yoke, and the massive bomber clawed her way into the sky, fighting gravity with every foot of altitude. They climbed in formation with 63 other bombers, a sky full of silver giants heading northwest across the Philippine Sea. Below, the turquoise water stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and utterly indifferent. At 7,000 feet, Briggs called out from his flight engineer station. "Number 3 engines running hot, Skipper. Cylinder head temps are already at 260 Celsius. Fitzgerald's stomach tightened. That was high, but not critical yet. The red line was 287. "Keep an eye on it." "Roger that." The sky ahead was clear, but Fitzgerald knew that meant nothing. The real danger wouldn't come from the weather. It would come from the engines, from the Japanese fighters waiting over the home islands, from the flak batteries that could turn the sky into a wall of exploding steel, and from the simple mathematics of distance. They were flying into the teeth of the enemy, loaded with enough fuel and bombs to make them flying coffins if anything went wrong. Reeves glanced over at him, young eyes trying to look confident. "Think we'll catch hell over the target?" Fitzgerald didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on the instrument panel, watching the needles, listening to the engines, feeling the aircraft through the controls like a living thing. "We always do." The formation leveled off at 8,000 feet, engines droning, propellers cutting circles in the thin air. Below, the ocean rolled on forever, empty and cold. And somewhere ahead, Japan waited. The war continued, as it always did, in the space between hope and fire. 3 hours into the flight, the Philippine Sea gave way to the East China Sea, and the bomber stream began a gradual climb toward their combat altitude of 24,000 feet. Inside Midnight Runner, the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and the crew breathed through oxygen masks that hissed with every inhalation. Frost formed on the inside of the plexiglass windows. The cabin pressure was minimal. Every man wore heavy fleece-lined flight suits and heated gloves, but the cold still found ways to seep in, biting at fingers and toes. Fitzgerald's eyes never left the gauges. All 4 engine temperature needles were climbing steadily, hovering in the yellow zone between safe and dangerous. Number 3 was still the hottest at 270 Celsius, but now number 1 was catching up at 265. The R-3350 engines were marvels of engineering, each one capable of producing 2,200 horsepower, but they were also notorious for overheating, especially when pushed hard at high altitude with heavy loads. "Tom, how we looking?" Fitzgerald's voice crackled through the intercom. Briggs was hunched over his engineer's panel, a complex array of gauges, switches, and levers that monitored fuel flow, oil pressure, cylinder head temperatures, and a dozen other critical systems. "Not great, Skipper. We're burning fuel at the high end of normal, and I'm seeing oil temps creeping up on all 4 mills. The cooling flaps are wide open, but it's not helping much. Can we lean out the mixture?" "Already done. We're running as efficient as we can without risking detonation." Fitzgerald exchanged a glance with Reeves. The co-pilot's face was pale, his jaw working nervously. They both knew what this meant. The B-29 had magnesium engine components that could ignite if temperatures got too high. An engine fire at altitude, over open water, loaded with fuel and bombs, was every crew's nightmare. You couldn't just land. You couldn't just bail out. You had to make decisions in seconds that would determine whether 11 men lived or died. Kowalski's voice came through from the navigator's station behind the cockpit. "We're 400 miles from the Japanese coast. Current ground speed 195 knots. Estimate landfall in 2 hours and 6 minutes. 2 hours. 120 minutes over empty ocean with engines that were already cooking themselves." Fitzgerald did the math in his head. If they lost an engine now, they could probably maintain altitude on 3. If they lost 2, they'd have to descend and burn more fuel trying to stay airborne, which would mean they might not make it back. If they lost 3... He pushed the thought away. At 15,000 feet, the formation entered a thin layer of cirrus clouds, wispy and insubstantial. The other bombers appeared and disappeared like silver ghosts. The radio chatter was minimal, just check-ins and position reports. Everyone was focused, professional, locked in. Then the first indication of trouble came, sharp and sudden. "Fire warning light on number 3. Briggs shouted. Fitzgerald's hand moved instinctively to the fire suppression system. "Confirmed." "Checking. Negative fire. False alarm. But temp just spiked to 280. "We're at the red line, Captain." Fitzgerald's mind raced through the options. They could shut down number 3, feather the prop, and continue on 3 engines. But that would mean increased load on the other 3, which were already running hot. Or they could reduce power, lose altitude, and drop out of formation, making themselves an easy target for Japanese fighters if any showed up. "How long can we run at red line?" he asked. Briggs hesitated. "Unknown, sir. Could be 5 minutes, could be 50. These engines, they're unpredictable." Sullivan's voice crackled from the tail gun position. "Aircraft dropping out of formation, 7 o'clock low. Looks like she's got an engine smoking." Fitzgerald couldn't see it from the cockpit, but he could imagine it. Another B-29 crew facing the same demon, making the same impossible calculations. Drop out alone and risk fighters, or push on and risk catastrophic engine failure. At 18,000 feet, number 1 engine joined number 3 at the red line. 2 engines now running at maximum temperature, the magnesium components glowing white-hot inside the cowlings, oil temperatures climbing toward the point where the lubricant would break down and the pistons would seize. "We need to make a decision, Bob," Reeves said quietly. Fitzgerald stared ahead at the empty sky. The Japanese coast was still 90 minutes away. Behind them, nothing but water. Ahead, an industrial city that needed to burn if this war was ever going to end. He thought about the 5,000 other airmen in the formation, all betting their lives on the same mission. He thought about the Marines dying on Iwo Jima, buying land with blood so that B-29s would have an emergency landing strip 800 miles from Japan. He thought about doing his job. "We maintain altitude and continue mission," he said. His voice was flat, commander's voice, no room for doubt. Briggs didn't respond, but Fitzgerald could feel the engineer's fear through the intercom silence. Every man on the crew knew what that decision meant. They were committed now. Committed to the engines holding together. Committed to the ocean passing beneath them. Committed to steel and fire and luck. At 22,000 feet, Matthews called out from the upper forward gun turret. "Bogey, 2 o'clock high. Single-engine fighter." Fitzgerald's blood went cold. Japanese interceptors this far out meant they'd been spotted, tracked, and targeted. The fighter flashed past above them, too fast to identify, probably a reconnaissance plane radioing their position back to the mainland. "Stay sharp, gunners," Fitzgerald ordered. "They know we're coming." The bomber continued climbing, engines roaring, temperatures climbing, the crew silent except for position reports and system checks. The fear was palpable now, a living thing in the aircraft, invisible but undeniable. Every man was doing the math, calculating odds, making peace with whatever god they prayed to. At 24,000 feet, they leveled off. The formation tightened. The Japanese coastline appeared on the horizon, a dark smudge against the lighter gray of the sky. And all 4 engine temperature needles were buried in the red zone, holding steady in a place where they shouldn't be able to hold at all. The mission was just beginning. The coast of Japan materialized through the thin haze like a threat made solid, jagged mountains, industrial sprawl, and the dark geometric shapes of Kobe spreading across the harbor. At 24,000 feet, the bomber stream looked like a migration of silver birds, 64 B-29s in tight combat formation, their contrails painting white lines across the afternoon sky. On the ground below, air raid sirens were already wailing. "Flak at 12 o'clock level," O'Brien shouted from his gun position. The first bursts appeared ahead of the formation, black puffs of smoke that hung in the air like malevolent flowers. Then more. Dozens. Hundreds. The Japanese anti-aircraft batteries opened up with everything they had, 88mm guns, 105mm guns, filling the sky with exploding steel. The sound was muffled inside the pressurized cabin, but Fitzgerald could feel each nearby explosion as a pressure wave, a thump against the fuselage like a giant's fist. Midnight Runner shuddered as a burst detonated 50 yards off the right wing. Shrapnel peppered the aluminum skin with a sound like hail on a tin roof. "Damage report," Fitzgerald barked. Right wing punctured, multiple holes, no critical systems hit. Jackson called back. The bomber to their left, Pacific Prowler, took a direct hit. The explosion was silent from this distance, but horrifyingly visual. The entire tail section separated from the fuselage, spinning away as the bomber nosed down, trailing smoke and fire. Fitzgerald counted 7 parachutes before the wreckage disappeared into the clouds below. 4 men hadn't made it out. "Bomb bay doors opening," Porter announced from the bombardier position in the nose. The massive doors beneath the aircraft swung open, exposing the incendiary cluster bombs to the rushing air. The drag increased immediately, forcing the engines to work harder to maintain speed. And that's when number 3 engine finally gave up. "Fire on number 3. Briggs screamed. Confirmed fire, red light, temperature off the scale. Fitzgerald didn't hesitate. His hand slammed the fire suppression handle, flooding the engine nacelle with CO2. The propeller windmilled for a moment, then he hit the feather button, and the blades rotated to reduce drag, stopping the wild spinning. The fire went out. But the engine was dead. Oil pressure dropping on number 1. Briggs called out, "We're losing lubrication." The aircraft bucked as another flak burst exploded underneath them, close enough that Fitzgerald smelled the cordite. The formation was in the heart of the firestorm now, the air so thick with flak that it seemed impossible to fly through without being torn apart. Bombers on all sides were being hit, some falling away trailing smoke, some exploding outright, some grimly hanging on. 30 seconds to release point," Porter called out, his voice steady despite the hell around them. Number 1 engine began knocking, a violent metallic hammering that Fitzgerald could feel through the control yoke. Cylinder head temperature climbed past 300 Celsius. The engine was destroying itself, but it was still producing power, still turning, still fighting. 20 seconds. A Japanese Ki-84 fighter screamed past the nose, cannons blazing. The streams of tracers missed by yards, but the gunners opened up, the .50 caliber machine guns hammering from every turret. The sky became a chaos of metal, smoke, fire, and desperation. 10 seconds. Number 2 engine began overheating now, temperature climbing rapidly into the red zone. 3 engines in crisis, 1 dead. They were flying on borrowed time, every second a gift they hadn't earned. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 6 tons of incendiaries fell free, tumbling toward the city below. Fitzgerald didn't wait to see the impact. He banked hard right, fighting to get out of the flak zone, the 3 remaining engines screaming at maximum power. Then number 1 engine seized. The knocking stopped. The propeller stopped. The engine simply quit, locked solid, internal components welded together by heat and friction. The sudden loss of power yawed the aircraft violently to the left. Fitzgerald stood on the right rudder pedal, straining against the imbalance, while Reeves pushed the throttles on engines 2 and 4 to maximum. "Feather number 1. Fitzgerald ordered. Briggs hit the controls. The propeller blades rotated to feathered position. 2 engines left. 2 engines to carry them over 400 miles of open ocean, with no emergency landing sites, no rescue ships close enough to matter, and fuel that was already calculated to the edge of their range even with all 4 engines running. "We're not gonna make it back to Tinian," Kowalski said quietly from the navigator station. "Even if 2 and 4 hold together, we don't have the fuel reserve to maintain altitude on partial power." Fitzgerald's mind was already 3 moves ahead. "What about Iwo Jima?" "It's closer, but we'd have to descend to 10,000 feet to conserve fuel. That puts us in range of enemy fighters the whole way." "Do the math, Jeff. Can we make Iwo on 2 engines?" A pause. The scratch of pencil on paper. 15 seconds that felt like hours. "Maybe. If we shed weight, maintain optimal glide, and nothing else breaks. Maybe." Fitzgerald looked at the instrument panel. Oil pressure on number 2 was declining, temperature climbing. Number 4 was the only engine running in normal parameters, and it was working twice as hard as it should be. The needles told a story that ended in the ocean. "All crew, this is the captain," Fitzgerald said, his voice cutting through the fear and chaos. "We're heading for Iwo Jima. We've got 2 engines and a prayer. Dump everything that's not bolted down. Guns, ammunition, equipment, personal gear. Lighten this bird. We're going home, gentlemen." The crew moved immediately. Gunners pulled the .50 caliber machine guns from their mounts and jettisoned them through the windows. Ammunition cans went next, followed by equipment boxes, toolkits, spare parts, flak jackets, anything with weight. Through the windows, Fitzgerald watched the debris tumble away, falling toward the ocean far below. Midnight Runner turned southeast, leaving the burning city behind, leaving the formation behind, alone now over the vast Pacific with 2 engines and the slow realization that they were in a race against physics, fuel, and fate. The coast of Japan disappeared behind them. Ahead, nothing but water. And the engine temperature needles kept climbing. At 12,000 feet, number 2 engine began the death rattle. The oil pressure gauge dropped to 20 psi, then 15, then 10. The temperature climbed past 320 Celsius, far beyond anything the engine was designed to withstand. Inside the massive radial engine, the pistons were running nearly dry, metal scraping against metal, generating heat that would have melted lead. "She's gonna seize any second," Briggs said, his voice tight with dread. "I can't cool her down. The cooling system's maxed out, and we're out of options." Fitzgerald felt the engine struggling through the vibration in the yoke. The 18 cylinders were fighting a losing battle, but they were still fighting, still turning, still giving him altitude and airspeed. He thought about his training, about all the manuals and procedures, about the careful calculations that went into every flight. None of it mattered now. This was beyond the textbooks. "How far to Iwo?" he asked. 220 miles, Kowalski replied. "At current speed and descent rate, 98 minutes. 98 minutes. And number 2 wouldn't last 10. The ocean below was absolutely empty. No ships, no islands, no hope of rescue if they went down. The water temperature was 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time for a man in the water, even with a life vest, was maybe 4 hours before hypothermia took him. The B-29 carried a life raft, but deploying it in a ditching was a coin flip at best. Most crews that ditched never made it out of the sinking aircraft. "All crew, prepare for single-engine flight," Fitzgerald announced. His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking on the yoke. "When number 2 goes, we're down to number 4 alone. We'll lose altitude fast. Stay strapped in and stay ready." Reeves looked at him, and for a moment the kid's composure cracked. "Can we make it on 1 engine?" Fitzgerald didn't answer. He didn't know. The B-29 wasn't designed to fly on 1 engine at gross weight, even reduced weight. The aerodynamics didn't work. The single engine couldn't produce enough thrust to overcome the drag. At best, they'd enter a controlled descent, trading altitude for distance, hoping they could glide far enough before the ocean took them. Then number 2 engine made the decision for them. The seizure was violent. A sound like a car crash inside the engine nacelle, metal tearing, components disintegrating. The propeller stopped turning mid-rotation, frozen at an awkward angle. Fitzgerald hit the feather control, but the mechanism wouldn't respond. The prop stayed windmilling slightly, creating massive drag, pulling them left. The aircraft yawed hard. Fitzgerald stood on the right rudder with all his weight, Reeves helping on the controls. Number 4 engine howled at full throttle, trying to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. The bomber shook like a dog trying to shed water. "We're descending at 500 feet per minute," Reeves called out, watching the altimeter unwind. We need to level off. Can't, Fitzgerald grunted, fighting the controls. Full right rudder and she's still pulling left. That windmilling prop is killing us. At 10,000 feet, they were still 190 miles from Iwo Jima. The math was simple and brutal. At 500 feet per minute descent, they had 20 minutes of altitude left. Even if they could stretch the glide, maintain optimal airspeed, catch every updraft, they'd hit the water at least 80 miles short of the island. The crew was silent now. Every man knew. They'd done everything right, dumped the weight, nursed the engines, made every correct decision, and it wasn't enough. The ocean was going to win. Fitzgerald thought about his wife, Mary, waiting in San Diego with their 2-year-old daughter. He thought about the letter in his flight suit pocket, the one he'd written but never sent, the one that tried to explain why he kept flying these missions when he could have rotated home after 25. He thought about the men behind him, 11 lives dependent on decisions made in fractions of seconds. "Radio," he said quietly. "Send out our position and situation. Tell them we're ditching." Nakamura keyed the mic. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Midnight Runner, Baker 29er, declaring emergency. 2 engines failed, descending through 10,000 feet, position 190 miles northwest of Iwo Jima. Preparing to ditch." Repeat, preparing to ditch. The response came back through static. "Midnight Runner, this is Iwo Tower. Roger your mayday. Be advised, rescue vessels are 2 hours from your position. Recommend maintaining maximum altitude and airspeed." 2 hours. They had 20 minutes. At 8,000 feet, something changed. Briggs was staring at his instruments, his face locked in concentration. "Skipper, I'm getting an idea, but it's crazy." "I'm listening." "Number 3. We shut it down after the fire, but the engine's still intact. It's cold now. If we could restart it, even for 10 minutes, it might give us enough thrust to reach the island." Fitzgerald's mind raced through the procedures. Restarting a failed engine in flight was dangerous. If there was residual fuel in the cylinders, it could ignite explosively. If the cowling had fire damage, introducing air could reignite it. But if it worked— "Do it," he said. Briggs worked the controls with practiced speed. Fuel mixture rich. Magnetos on. Starter engaged. The propeller began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. 1 revolution. 2, 3. Nothing. "Come on," Briggs whispered. "Come on, you beautiful bitch." 4 revolutions. 5. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught. The sound was the most beautiful thing Fitzgerald had ever heard. The roar of 18 cylinders firing, the sudden surge of power, the yaw to the right as thrust came online. He eased off the right rudder, let the aircraft stabilize, felt her respond to the controls like she was alive again. "Oil pressure coming up," Briggs said, his voice shaking. "Temperature's climbing, but it's in normal range." "She's running." They were at 7,500 feet now. The descent rate slowed. 400 feet per minute. 300. 250. With 2 engines providing thrust, they could maintain a shallow descent instead of a deadly plummet. "Distance to Iwo?" Fitzgerald asked. 160 miles. 70 minutes at current speed. The math worked now. They had 7,500 feet of altitude and 70 minutes to fly. As long as number 3 held together, as long as number 4 didn't quit, as long as no other system failed, they would make it. At 6,000 feet, they saw the island. A dark speck on the horizon, growing slowly larger. Mount Suribachi rising from the south end like a broken tooth. The airstrip running along the narrow waist of the island, carved out of volcanic ash and Japanese bunkers by Marines who died by the thousands to take it. At 3,000 feet, Fitzgerald could see the runway clearly. Iwo Tower, Midnight Runner on final approach, 2 engines, requesting priority landing. Roger, Midnight Runner. You are cleared to land any runway. Crash crews standing by. The gear came down with a reassuring thunk. The flaps extended. Number 3 engine was running at 320 Celsius, destroying itself 1 revolution at a time, but still running. Number 4 was steady, loyal, the only engine that hadn't failed them. At 500 feet, Fitzgerald cut the power on number 3. The engine seized immediately, locking solid, but it didn't matter anymore. They had the runway made. The wheels touched volcanic ash at 130 miles per hour. The tires screamed. The brakes bit hard. Midnight Runner rolled down the runway, slowing, finally stopping 3,000 feet from the threshold. Fitzgerald shut down number 4 engine. The sudden silence was profound. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Reeves started laughing, a sound somewhere between joy and hysteria. The crew began unbuckling, checking each other, touching the fuselage like they couldn't believe it was real. Fitzgerald climbed out of the seat and walked back through the aircraft. The interior was a mess, stripped bare, everything non-essential gone. Through the windows, he could see the fire trucks and ambulances racing toward them, could see the Marines watching from the edge of the runway, could see the ocean beyond, gray and endless. Briggs appeared beside him, his face streaked with oil and exhaustion. 3 engines failed. We flew 120 miles on one and a prayer. I've been working on these birds for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Fitzgerald put his hand on the engineer's shoulder. You saved us, Tom. That restart on number 3. I wouldn't have thought of it. You made the call to try for EWO. That saved us too. They stood there in the damaged bomber, surrounded by their crew, 11 men who should have been at the bottom of the Pacific but weren't. Outside, the medics were climbing into the aircraft, checking for injuries, but no one was hurt. They'd lost 3 engines and most of their equipment, but they hadn't lost a single man. Later, after the debriefing, after the squadron commander heard the full story and immediately grounded Midnight Runner pending major repairs, Fitzgerald walked down to the beach. The sun was setting over the ocean, turning the water the same blood-red color it had been that morning over Tinian. It felt like a lifetime ago. He thought about the 31,000 pounds of incendiaries they dropped on Kobe, about the buildings that burned, about the enemy industrial capacity they destroyed. He thought about Pacific Prowler going down with 4 men still inside. He thought about the razor's edge between success and failure, between life and death, between the decisions that saved you and the ones that killed you. The war would continue. More missions. More cities. More bombers pushing across the Pacific with engines that ran too hot and crews that were too brave. But tonight, 11 men were alive who had no right to be. Tonight, they'd crossed open water with every engine failing at once, and somehow, impossibly, they'd made it home. Fitzgerald pulled the letter from his pocket and tore it into small pieces, letting the wind carry them away. He didn't need to explain any more. Mary would understand when she saw him again. The ocean rolled on, eternal and indifferent, holding its secrets beneath the waves. And somewhere over Japan, another formation of B-29s was making the long flight home.